Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today, I want to continue our conversation about human diversity, and this conversation is going to focus on the concept of ethnicity, and we want to talk about what that means and why that's actually a good descriptor of finding an identity, an individual and a cultural identity. But before we do that, I want to talk about race. And ultimately, when you're talking about biologically, race has a very specific definition. What it means is that you have a population of organisms, right, that is different from another population of the same species, and the way that it is different is genetic, right? It has a significant, within a species, significant difference, and it's isolated, but it's not different enough to be a different species, because if those two populations come together, they can still interbreed in the wild. They are still very similar genetically, right? And so what we're really talking about here is subspecies. A race in biology is a subspecies. Sub, we think, has a negative connotation. In this case, it doesn't. It just means it's a more exclusive taxonomic characterization, okay? And we're going to look at morphology, geographical location, and the gene frequency within those subspecies. And when we talk about other species, let's talk about chimpanzees, for instance, gorillas. There are actually subspecies of chimpanzees and gorillas because there are super isolated populations. Because their populations in total are really small, and so they actually have these little pockets, right? You've got mountain gorillas and you've got lowland gorillas, and they never interact with each other. And so over time, they have accrued a fairly significant number of genetic differences in the two populations. Having said that, they are all still gorillas. When they get together, if you were to take a mountain gorilla and a lowland gorilla in a zoo, for instance, and they could have offspring, and they would be viable offspring. They would be adorable little gorillas, right? Some species don't have that, right? Most species actually don't have subspecies because the populations are, you have connected populations, or you have, well, actually I take it back. I wouldn't say most species don't have them, but species that have populations that are connected to each other, like the human species, we don't have long-term isolated populations that accrue enough genetic mutations to be different species. Now, historically, that has not always been true. There is actually a subspecies, a pocket population that existed tens of thousands of years ago that is now extinct, but that was a small subpopulation. That is the only subpopulation of humans that has ever existed that we know of. But today, right, our real question is, do we have different biological races among the human population? And the answer this has been a question for a long time, and the answer has been discussed as early as Darwin. Darwin actually doubted that there were races, right? And it turns out that biologically, right, when we have so much variety, Darwin's argument was that natural selection would have filtered out some of these things if the differences were really truly significant, right? They would have been removed by natural selection. And that's a really strong point. It's not actually the point that we're going to use to discuss whether or not there are biological races, but I think it's interesting to note that this has always been a very questionable thing. Now, we do know from our activity that the intensity of skin pigmentation actually changes significantly from the equator to the poles, right? And so what you find is, and what we found was that having darker skin near the equator helps protect against skin cancer, because melanin absorbs UV and protects the DNA in the cells. And this is really important if you live in a place that gets lots and lots of intense sunlight. Now, having said that, as you go further north, you start to see skin color lighten and lighten and lighten until it's very, very light when you get up into Northern Europe, right, for instance. And so the question becomes, why? Right? It turns out that there's actually no pressure that decreases melanin in relation to UV. You're going to have UV everywhere you go, right? The sun shines more or less everywhere that you go. And so there's not a significant pressure in the UV conversation to decrease melanin content. Now, having said that, though, we just said that there's a blocking factor to melanin, right? There's another reaction in your body that requires sunlight. So too much sunlight is bad because you can get skin cancer, but not enough is also bad because sunlight facilitates the vitamin D calcium reaction in your body. And so this is a very, and we're going to talk about this more in class, but this is a very significant reaction. It's very important. It needs to be done. Otherwise, you are not healthy, right? If melanin impedes that, that's a problem. As you go up into higher latitudes, the intensity of the solar radiation, of the incident solar radiation, is not as high, and during some seasons, the day is very, very short. And so you need to be able to absorb as much as possible, right? So melanin would get in the way. So there are actually two pressures we're dealing with. Near the equator, where you have lots of sun, you want to protect yourself from skin cancer. But as you go further north, where you don't have as much sun, you still need to have that vitamin D calcium reaction that's going on in your body. Melanin blocks that. So there are two opposite pressures, one for dark skin and one against it, one for lighter skin. And so this is natural selection, right? Many of the other traits that you saw really didn't have any sort of selective feature. Hair color, really not so much, right? But going off of that same idea, body type did matter, right? Taller and thinner allows more air to pass around your body, and that allows more evaporation. This is great if you're in a hot climate, right? So when we take that same map and we start looking at just Africa, you can see it's going to be very hot. But as we start moving north, and I don't have a map of the world, but we've already talked about it, as you move further north, you get colder and colder and colder. You might want to have more insulation. If you have a body type that is stockier, that will be more successful. And there have been very cool experiments done about how that extra body fat actually does retain heat. And it's very cool. So those are things that actually do have selective components, right? Other things, hair color, eye shape, those sorts of things, really don't. Those are neutral variations. And in reality, all of them do nothing to change or make one group better than the other, because each group is either having random neutral traits that don't mean anything at all, or they have traits that are selected for in their environment. And that's equally important. They are both equally successful. And that's actually kind of cool when you think about it biologically. All right. Now, by 1950, in the scientific community, there was really serious doubt about the idea of race. And by this time, socially, we've got this construct of placing people into these various groups that we're all very familiar with. But it turns out that has nothing to do with biology. There are no biological races, right? There are no biological races. And when you start looking at the genetics involved in humans, right, population subdivision is very weak, right? We are very closely related genetically. This bar is us, right? All of these other bars, this is the genetic difference in all these other species, including our closest relative, chimpanzees, have way more genetic variety. And we've talked about this in class too. There's way more genetic variety and much less phenotypic variety. We moved very far and very fast, and we got little small groups, and we were exposed to many different environments, and those all came together to give us the wonderful variety that we see, that beautiful spectrum of different body types, different heights, different eye colors, different hair colors, different skin colors, that make us the most phenotypically diverse large mammal out there. And that's kind of cool. And biologically, it's really interesting. So ultimately, what we find is that when we look at genetics, we cannot cluster people into the constructs that we've created, right? Biologically, we cannot do that, okay? And so there were some groups that have actually looked at the genetics of a wide variety of different ethnic groups, and they really couldn't cluster them. What they found was that you ended up getting, based on DNA variation, 5 major groups. And those major groups are Sub-Saharan Africans, Europeans, Middle Easterners, South Asians, and North Africans. They're all one group. Then you have East Asia, you have Native Americans, and we know from our other conversations that Native Americans, modern Native Americans, are all of Siberian heritage. And then we have Pacific Islanders. Those are not groups that match what we traditionally think about as racial groups. Okay, so if there are no biological races, why are there so many different groups? Well, we've already talked about that biologically, but what happens when you have small populations that spread out across the world? The environment itself not only shapes them physically and behaviorally, it shapes them culturally. And this is where we can talk about the idea of ethnicity, right? An ethnic group is defined by language, religion, geography, history, ancestry, and physical traits, right? So when you start looking at different people, right, when you look at the traditional clothing, when you look at the traditional music, the languages, the traditional religions, right, the housing structures, all of these things, you can get a good idea of where someone comes from, what community they belong to. And we are very much social creatures, and community is a very important thing to us. And we will talk about that in the next unit called Building Community, because as primates, we are social. We are biologically pushed to be social for lots of reasons. And because we have the brains that we do, and we've developed the way that we have many complex layers that go with that sociability, right? Okay, so we think that if you just look at somebody, you can get an idea of who they are and where they're from. But it turns out it's much more complicated than this. And this is why I was talking about ethnicity being a much better identifier than anything else, right? So ultimately, what are the role of ethnic groups, right? Why do people find their heritage to be such an important thing? Well, the passing on of cultural traditions, right? It's the focal point of various kinds of interaction. It provides groups, community groups that give you an identity. It provides friends. It provides marriage partners. Can also provide hobbies, business contexts, a political power base, and political power bases give you money, right? They give you status, all of those things. Now, on the downside, because you're talking about groups that identify with themselves and can sometimes be relatively exclusive, right? This can give rise to all kinds of negative things, clannishness, distrust, suspicion. Oh, those people eat different food. Those people have a different hobby. Those people do different things. Oh, that's kind of scary. And that is not the positive part of this, right? And it's one of the things when we talk about multiculturalism, what we're trying to do is celebrate those differences and also recognize common bonds, because no matter what your ethnicity is, no matter what you like to eat or do or who you hang out with, we are all human and we all have common bonds underlying all of those differences. And so in this course, we're going to highlight those differences because many of them are based on geography, and it's very interesting and it's very cool. But by the same token, we are all still one species. We are all still one very closely related family, meaning we have commonalities, we have common bonds, and we want to identify those as well, because those are the things that help negate that suspicion and distrust and violence. Okay, so here is your first mini quiz question. All of the following clearly denote one's ethnicity except... Here are some examples. Your grandparents immigrated from Bavaria. You perform a ceremonial dance at a special event. Your parents are Roman Catholic. Your family comes from an isolated region, so you speak a unique dialect like Basque. Well, it turns out Being Roman Catholic, for instance, while religion oftentimes is part of ethnicity, it's not always the only thing. Some ethnicities have overlap. They share various traits. It's the whole collection of ideas that make the ethnicity. And the thing with Roman Catholic, that may actually be part of your cultural identity, but it is in fact part of lots of people's cultural identity, and so it's not a unique identifier. All right, so some of the problems that are encountered when defining an ethnic group, right? There's a lot of controversy around what actually an ethnicity is and getting a working definition. The word ethnic is derived from the Greek word ethnos, and it means people or nation. And people of common ancestry and cultural tradition is what we usually mean by when we talk about a nation, right? But by the same token, and we'll talk about this when we talk about sovereign states, for instance, nation we use synonymously with country, but in reality, nation means people of common ancestry and cultural tradition. So we'll talk about later that maybe not all countries are in fact nations, even though we use the word nation a lot, right? Ultimately, what you have is a strong feeling of group identity and of belonging, and that's what characterizes ethnicity. Okay. Now, membership in an ethnic group is actually involuntary, right? When you're talking about ethnicity, you have to actually be born into that group, right? You can't just decide that you identify with a group and then you become that ethnicity historically. Now, that's changing and people argue with that, and so that's a controversial thing. But traditionally, when we look at ethnicity, you are born into it. You are born into it. It doesn't mean people can't identify with ethnicities, but if you are not born into it, traditionally, you are not considered really part of that ethnic group. And this is one of the problems with it, actually. Now, having said that, people will sometimes choose to discard their ethnicity, perhaps for another one, right? Maybe you move to another country or you go to some place and then you discard your ethnicity for the larger, right, idea of whatever it is that you're doing, right? That's a thing too, and there's lots of controversy surrounding all of this, by the way, and so we could get into huge arguments for days and days and days about all of this stuff. So what I'm doing is just presenting to you the traditional definitions. All right, so which of the following would describe a race but not an ethnicity? Your parents are from Asia, your grandparents are Sherpas, you and your family have always lived in Krakow, which is in Poland, you just celebrated your bat mitzvah. Well, if you are a Sherpa, that is actually a group of people, right? That is an ethnicity. Okay, they live in Nepal, by the way, in case you were interested. If you have always lived in Krakow, your family has lived there, your ethnicity may be Polish, right? Now, there may be a sub-ethnicity in that as well. Maybe you come from a particular neighborhood that you identify with, but that is an ethnicity, right? If you just celebrated your bat mitzvah, being Jewish is an ethnicity, right? If your grandparents are from Asia, Asia is a continent, and Asia has lots of different ethnic groups, lots and lots and lots of different ethnic groups, and yet we say Asian is a race. It does not actually reflect any of the differences. You could be from India or you could be from China. No one would argue that they are the same ethnicity, right? And yet they would both be from Asia. Okay, now this feeling of pride or affinity to your ethnic group has lots of positives, right? But when you take that a step further and you start thinking, my group is better than someone else's group, and I don't look at them as being just another group with differences equal to me, I start looking at them as being less, then we're starting to talk about ethnocentrism. And this is where you start talking about rivalry, suspicion, and violence. And this is a bad thing, actually. So remember, anything to the extreme usually has negative connotations, right? Intolerance is one of the things that comes up with this. Okay, so let's talk about what ethnic groups look like in terms of neighborhoods, right? There are lots of neighborhoods all across the United States, all across the world, that are enclaves. People in the same ethnic groups will have a tendency to want to associate with other people that they feel comfortable with, that they feel familiar with, that they know understand their foods, their traditions, their music, their clothing, their culture, right? All of the, well, those are all parts of culture, but all those things. And so what you get are voluntary neighborhoods that are ethnic enclaves. The occupants there usually choose to preserve their cultural traditions. There's usually an internal cohesiveness to the group, and typically they want to maintain some homogeneity in that group, so they maintain all of their traditions. Okay, and if you've traveled around any cities, you can recognize when you move into an ethnic enclave, right? So which cue would probably not announce that you've entered an ethnic enclave? Architecture and adornments, signage in multiple languages, a storefront that advertises specially prepared foodstuffs, or you overhear people speaking another language. It's going to be all of the things within the neighborhood that really make it the ethnic enclave. All of those big cues that you're seeing: food, religious structures, housing structures, even the way people hang their laundry out, right, in cities. Those are going to be the things. If you just hear another language, lots of people speak lots of languages all over the world, right? Anywhere you go. And frankly, you could be listening to tourists. You don't even know. So just speaking another language doesn't mean you're in an ethnic enclave. You need all of the other stuff that goes with it. All right, so in the next few slides, what I've done is just identified some of the really famous ethnic enclaves in the US, just so you can see that in the United States, and ethnic enclaves are all over the world. Europe has lots of ethnic enclaves, and the makeup of those is changing over time, and you can look into that. But in the United States, we are well known for our cultural neighborhoods. And so we're going to start with probably one of the most famous, and that's the North End in Boston. It's Italian dominated, and basically it is really traditional. They have maintained their ethnic identity for as long as they've been here, right? Lots of the ethnic enclaves, earliest ethnic enclaves in the United States, were actually European, right? On the East Coast, right? And then you move into the center of the country, you also have lots of European enclaves. And then in the East Coast, what you see are more Asian enclaves, right? Because if you think about migration, and we will be talking about this, when you think about migration, you have to think about where people are coming from, where are they going to settle, right? In the South and Southwest, you have lots of Caribbean, and you have lots of Central and South American enclaves. And that makes sense. And again, we'll look at that later on. Here's another one in Nebraska, where they have the National Czech Festival every year. Everybody dresses up, has lots of food. I personally enjoy the less talk, more polka sign because I think it's fun. All right. And actually, interestingly enough, you will find places that have lots of different ethnicities, and you will have lots of different festivals. People really love to celebrate their heritage. They're all fun things to go to. We have a bunch here in North Texas, and I encourage you to find an ethnicity that is very different from one you identify with and go and celebrate with them. All right, European enclaves are also famous from all over Europe, Western and Eastern Europe. I put a couple in Texas just in case you want to check them out. And then Latin American and Caribbean enclaves. Some of these came up a little bit later than some of the European, but some of them are just as old, depending on where you are. All kinds of ethnic enclaves, Southeast Asian enclaves, right? The idea of the Chinatown or the Little Tokyo or Little Saigon. And we actually have several ethnic enclaves here in Dallas. And they are interesting because the language is different. So when you go into the enclaves that I've mentioned previous, right, you can usually read the signage. You may not speak the language, so you don't actually know what it says. But when you start moving into the Asian and Arabic enclaves, and sometimes the Russian enclaves, right, you will have a completely different alphabet, which is kind of interesting too. All right, and just here are some more. And then Middle Eastern and Southwest Asian enclaves. Okay, so ethnic geography. When we start looking at all of these things, we can start mapping it and we can get a good idea of how people are moving, what they're doing, how they're interacting by just looking at ethnic geography. This is an actual field if you're interested in it. And the first thing that I want to talk about right here is what does not explain the distribution of races, ethnicities in a country. Climate, local industry, areas of forced labor, or location of origin, or location of country of origin. Well, it's climate, right? Climate does have some effect on where people settle, right? Obviously, people like it when it's warmer. People like less really bad weather, that sort of thing. But really, if you look at the distribution of people, that is a very small impact on stuff. Now, sometimes people will pick a climate in their new country that reminds them of their old country, right? And so, but that's not about the climate itself. It's about the location of the country of origin, right? Where was that? Also, how close was it to the new place and things like that. But local industry, people bring the skills with them from the places that they originate. So if you think about Alaska, right? Alaska, one of the big industries in Alaska is fishing, because the Bering Sea is a very rich fishery, right, for all these different species. So you're going to have people who have fishing skills come to that area. So what you find is that you have a really large Norwegian population there, right? Because they have a very robust fishing industry in the same kind of rough waters, and so it was easy for them to translate their skills. So when they migrated to a place where they could apply their trade. So you're going to find that local industry will reflect the country of origin. Areas of forced labor. When you are forced to come into a place, right? And we'll talk about this when we talk about the distribution of people in the United States, you're going to end up settling there. And oftentimes, because you were in forced labor, even when you are no longer in forced labor, oftentimes you're still in poverty and you don't have enough money to move away. And so you just stay where the generations before you were forced to be. So the answer to this is climate. Okay, so when we talk about ethnic geography, we're talking about movement, diffusion, migration, mixing, spatial distribution, and interactions. Okay, the cultural characteristics of ethnic groups and the influences underlying them are going to be the ultimate outcome of this study. Okay, and so we look at the built environment. That's all the stuff that you see, and it's like a book. You can see layers of ethnic groups that have been in places. And that's kind of a cool thing. So just as an example, you can often find ancient, extinct, or, migrated, vanished ethnicities in a region, right? So in Tuscany, it's really unique in Italy, for instance, and that's partly due to the Etruscans who lived there 2,000 years ago, right? They stopped being an ethnic group. They predate the Romans. The Romans sort of take over, and then the Etruscans kind of go away. There's a massive German presence in the American heartland because lots of German immigrants moved there, and yet it's not a German area. So there's an ethnic substrate that underlies the modern population. Okay, so what would not be indicative of an ethnic substrate? Local industry, place names, folklore, or monuments, and changes in landscape. Well, as we already know, local industry, in my Norway example, is going to really tell you about the history, right? It's an ethnic substrate. Place names, think about Texas. We have all kinds of Native American and Spanish names to things, and those reflect our heritage, right? other ethnic groups that have been dominant in the area at any given time. Folklore, and we'll talk more about myth and folklore later on, also a huge indicator of an ethnic substrate. Monuments and changes in landscape, though, those are modern. This is where you start covering up ethnic substrates. And monuments may in fact reflect an ethnic substrate, but oftentimes they don't, right? They reflect some other more dominant culture. Okay, so culture groups typically occupy compact territories. Ethnic regions, and especially ethnic enclaves, are usually really close-knit and really compact. Okay, and so in order to map these, we rely on some diverse data. Census totals for looking at languages spoken in the home and spoken by relatives. And previous generations, and also surnames. So names and language are really the big tools that we use, and they are not entirely accurate all the time, and each method produces a slightly different region. And I think probably one of the best examples of this, though, is about the Cajun population in Louisiana, right? And so when you start looking at that, you're looking for French surnames, and you're looking for people who speak or spoke French in the home, and what you get is a really similar map, right, of southern Louisiana. So it works really well. And here's just kind of a general map of the United States. When you start looking at general ethnic regions and their ethnic substrates, this is kind of what you get. And here are some that we'll actually talk about throughout the class. Acadiana, which is the Louisiana French, they are originally from Canada, actually, and so we'll talk about them later on. Cajun is what you're talking about. The Spanish American areas, some of the Native American areas, specifically the Navajo, the French Canadian, right, who are here from Quebec. They're here and in Canada, right, from Quebec. And then Deseret, which is the Mormon homeland in the Great Basin, right, in Utah. And so we'll look at all of these regions a little bit throughout the country. Okay, and here are just some other ethnic regions around the country. You can do this in any country. It doesn't matter what country you're talking about. Okay, and that is it. This one is a little bit longer than 30 minutes, so I'm sorry about that. But have a great day. Thank you for listening, and please ask any questions you have in class. I will see you next time.